If you've had acid reflux, bloating, or that heavy pit in your stomach sensation after eating for years and H. pylori finally showed up on a test, or maybe even it didn't, let's discuss why these are signals that your stomach terrain is likely already failing you. I'm Dr. Kenny, an IFM certified functional medicine practitioner, and catching this pattern after years of negative testing in my own life and now in the lives of my patients is one of the more common things I see in practice. Throwing antacids on top of this picture is almost always just like mopping up the floor rather than turning off the faucet of acid reflux. Here's what the standard line of questioning leaves out. Here's what gets missed in the standard line of questioning regularly. That window of time before the diagnosis is finally given when a standard H. pylori panel flags it as positive is perhaps one of the most diagnostically important parts of the clinical picture of H. pylori, because H. pylori doesn't just establish itself in a healthy gut environment. The organism is there because the terrain was already moving in a direction that made colonization possible, and it's sticking. And we're talking about things like stomach acid and microbiome health and beyond. Most people who finally test positive for H. pylori have gone through multiple rounds of conventional testing and oftentimes have been experiencing symptoms for years or even decades. Things that have been attributed to stress or just food sensitivities and intolerances or eating too fast. But really, the picture is so much deeper than that. So if we turn our line of questioning to what was happening in the stomach long before the positive test finally came into the picture, that question helps us to deeply reorient around the next clinical line of questioning. You can almost think of it as a weed in your garden. You can pull the weed, and if the soil conditions like the pH and the water levels and the nutrient profile still favor that particular weed, something is going to grow back in that same spot. The seed itself wasn't necessarily the problem. The soil that supported the seed's growth was. H. pylori works in a similar way. The organism, of course, is the seed, and the gastric environment, the acid, the nervous system signals, and beyond is the soil. So when stomach acid is adequate, when the mucus layer is intact, and when immune system surveillance inside of the stomach is running smoothly, H. pylori either doesn't take hold or stays contained to low levels without causing meaningful disruption. But when the terrain shifts, that can change. When the acid environment drops, whether that's from nervous system signaling or from antacid use, or the mucosal barrier gets thin because of inflammation and the immune defense gets thinner or less reliable, the organism now has room to establish itself in the deep, dark crypts of your stomach. And now the H. pylori organism has room to establish and grow and to replicate and to start changing the environment around it in ways that make it so much harder to clear. Research on the gastric microbiome confirms this directly. When stomach acidity drops, whether from atrophy of the mucosal lining or medications or other causes, the microbial landscape of the stomach shifts dramatically, and it creates an environment where organisms that otherwise wouldn't survive can take hold. And that's worth sitting with because it means the stomach's microbial state is not fixed, which we know about the rest of our microbiome. It's a reflection of the terrain and the safety signals or non-safety signals around it. And that terrain can change in both directions. So what this tells us clinically is that by the time H. pylori shows up on a test, the soil has likely already been compromised for some time, unless you're catching the very first acute flare. Eradication can clear the seed, but it doesn't fix the soil. And here's an incredibly important mechanism of the way that H. pylori acts in the stomach that can be counterintuitive for some people. What H. pylori does is it's changing your stomach's acid regulation set point. The organism produces an enzyme called urease, and you can think of it as an acid neutralizing agent. It creates a low acid pocket around itself, and this fools the stomach pH sensing systems into reading the local environment as less acidic than it actually is. And so the stomach can respond to that relatively false or artificial signal that's created by the H. pylori, And in some people, this just drives further acid suppression, and the stomach produces even less acid because it's been told not to produce more. In others, it pushes the acid output even higher in reaction to those low sensors. So the same organism, but a different terrain, can produce a different acid presentation in different individuals. This is why so many people with H. pylori are surprised to find out that they have low stomach acid when their primary symptom is the burning of acid reflux. Reflux sounds like too much acid, but what it really is simply displaced acid. When stomach acid drops below a threshold that's unique to each individual, that valve does not receive the chemical signal to close properly. And what comes up isn't excess necessarily, it's the insufficient acid that should have just stayed down, protected by that valve barrier. So you can see how perhaps the most conventional approach, like antacids that are available over the counter, in this picture are just not helpful. In fact, they could be moving the entire situation in the opposite direction that promotes healing. Because the standard line of questioning is someone develops acid reflux type symptoms, they see a doctor, or they reach for the shelf themselves over the counter, and they start a proton pump inhibitor, which is a medication that significantly reduces acid production at the chemical level. The reflux may improve symptomatically, sometimes dramatically and very quickly, and so they stay on it, often for years now, because the symptom is managed. But what's happening is your gastric environment during that time is experiencing a completely different story. Research shows that proton pump inhibitors don't just reduce stomach acid, they also measurably alter the microbial environment of the gut further down as well. And long-term use is linked to bacterial overgrowth, such as with SIBO or small intestinal bacterial overgrowth, and even increased susceptibility to infections, because our stomach acid is one of the first lines of defense against organisms that we eat that could be pathogenic or harmful. So one of the most commonly taken and prescribed medications for upper GI symptoms may itself be reshaping the entire gut microbiome that makes colonization of H. pylori and other overgrowth organisms to establish that much harder to clear. So here's the sequence that's playing out in many cases here. The terrain starts shifting for whatever reason, nervous system, and we'll talk about some of the others we get into. The reflux symptoms first appear, then someone goes on PPIs or over-the-counter antacids. The acid environment changes even further, and the microbial environment in both the stomach and the microbiome shifts. This is where H. pylori finds an even more hospitable environment, and years pass because culture and sensitivity testing just isn't sensitive enough many times to catch this bug that likes to burrow in the crypts of your stomach. And then a test finally catches it. And then the framing is, we found the problem, we'll treat the infection. I would argue that the infection is a downstream effect of the things that matter even more than the presence of H. pylori itself. Clearing it without questioning what is going on around it in the environment just leaves those same soil conditions intact. And I want to be clear about something here too, because I don't want to create the impression that H. pylori eradication is useless or the wrong call. In many cases, addressing the organism can be incredibly helpful, whether through the standard of treatment, which is generally triple antibiotic therapy, or an herbal antimicrobial approach. These are absolutely part of the picture and many of my patients' treatment plans. I'm a non-prescriber, so I tend to err on the side of the herbal approaches first. This is a real organism with real downstream effects on the body: protein digestion, motility and constipation, on the stomach's ability to keep other overgrowths in check, and of course, be a major immune system barrier from just the stomach acid alone. The question goes far beyond whether or not to address it, and more to what do we address alongside H. pylori. When researchers pooled data from 29 randomized controlled trials that involved almost 7,000 patients, they found high-quality evidence that eradicating H. pylori does in fact improve symptoms of functional dyspepsia, like acid reflux, for instance. But the key word here is improve, not resolve. A meaningful number of patients still had persistent symptoms, may be less severe even after getting rid of H. pylori. Clearing the organism only addresses one piece of the puzzle, but it doesn't automatically repair the terrain that allowed H. pylori to take hold in the first place. So if you've gone down this rabbit hole of treating H. pylori and still don't feel right, or experience symptoms, but you've tested negative in conventional testing, the research suggests that that is not unusual. It means that the environment, the upstream functional conditions that set the stage have not been addressed yet. If you'd like to dig into the studies behind this, I put together a free research summary in the description in the pinned comment below, and it walks through the findings and what they mean for your specific situation, so check that out. So let's talk the upstream conditions. The nervous system piece, stress chemistry, immune surveillance capacity, the integrity of the mucosal layer, even a well-executed eradication approach, whether through antibiotics or herbal approaches, falls short if the immune system doesn't have what it needs to hold resolution on the other side. I've had patients complete the triple antibiotic therapies successfully with their prescribers, and the organism is cleared by testing. And they came out sometimes feeling worse than when they went in because the microbiome disruption alone from the antibiotics compounded a terrain that was already depleted. So when I'm looking at these cases, I don't get as hung up on whether or not H. pylori alone is present. I try and look at the terrain and what it looks like now, and whether it's capable of holding resolution. Because many of the pieces that H. pylori content really doesn't touch is understanding ideas like stomach acid production being a nervous system output as well. Specifically, it's a rest and digest function, what researchers call parasympathetic activation, meaning the side of your nervous system that runs digestion and repair when the body is not managing a threat or stress chemistry. When that system is running well, your stomach acid production is usually quite robust. Digestion is effective. You're breaking down and absorbing your protein and amino acids so that you can repair areas of the body like neurotransmitters and hormones and tissues. The stomach's protective mechanisms are really supporting you at their finest in this case. But when someone is in a chronic stress dominant state or that fight or flight sympathetic mode, and I'm not talking about visible perceived stress necessarily, although that is a piece of the puzzle, I'm talking about the physiological chemical experience of stress, where the body's resources are allocated toward threat management and survival and alertness rather than repair and digestion. Sound familiar? Acid production drops, and not dramatically, not immediately, but over time, the terrain shifts as well. And this is one of the patterns that I see consistently in the patients who eventually land in my practice. They're often high performers and they've been running hard for years, whether through work or family or other aspirations. And their symptoms felt like minor inconveniences that they could manage with the quick popping of an over-the-counter antacid or something similar. They just managed around it. What they didn't know is that the nervous system's contribution, including things like stress hormone chemistry, to their gastric terrain was quietly piling up behind the scenes the entire time. And the terrain that results from that, the lower stomach acid output, the constipation or slow motility, and the compromised mucosal defenses in the stomach, is exactly the terrain that H. pylori loves to colonize in the most. And I'm genuinely curious about something if you're watching along. If you were eventually diagnosed with H. pylori after years of upper GI symptoms, and maybe even multiple rounds of testing, what was your experience like through that process? Drop it in the comments below. I read every single one of them. There's also a concept that comes up in my work as a functional medicine practitioner that I think deserves its own name and conversation around because it's incredibly relevant to this H. pylori conversation and framework. Before you even have symptoms that become diagnostically legible, if you will, before the tests come back positive or the presentation is clear enough for the prompt workup, there's a period where H. pylori is present, active, and already shaping your gastric environment. The same is true for many of these shifts that we see in chronic healing experiences. The organism is already influencing things like the acid feedback, it's altering the mucosal layer, and it's affecting downstream processes like protein digestion and motility. But behind all of that, you have a certain amount of capacity for compensation. The symptoms may be vague enough that you can either explain them away or power through them, and it doesn't bring you into the doctor's office for a deeper investigation because nothing is severe enough to demand it. This period is certainly not benign, and I think we do ourselves a great disservice in this current medical paradigm of waiting to react when symptoms are bad enough. This is the period oftentimes that we could shift and take advantage of, where the terrain is changing most consequentially, and when the right question, why is this environment becoming hospitable to the bad guys, would be the most actionable and able to be influenced. The moment something tips into a diagnosable presentation is what I call the threshold breach, the point where compensation stops being sufficient. And in retrospect, in patients who come to me after diagnosis, the signals from that window are almost always legible, especially when we use the hindsight 2020 line of questioning. Oftentimes, understanding the threshold breach and the factors that contributed to that is the difference between treating someone's chronic health condition like H. pylori and understanding their case a lot differently. When I work with patients on the terrain alongside the organism, or sometimes before formally addressing the organism too, depending on where their immune system and stress chemistry are, what they describe afterwards is different from what eradication alone produces. Not just fewer symptoms, but a qualitative shift in their life on how digestion feels, how their heaviness lifts, or their brain fog, or maybe their energy returns in a different way. The phrase I hear more often than you would expect is that I actually feel food working for me again. That's what adequate and ideal stomach function provides, the ability to actually access nourishment from the food that it is supposed to deliver. But we need to extract that nourishment with good stomach acid, protein digestion, mineral and vitamin absorption. The downstream signaling depends on what's happening upstream in the stomach. All of it runs on a gastric environment that's doing its job. So this is why the conversation of H. pylori cannot stop at just, is it there or is it not, and eradication alone. Without the terrain repair, it just leaves the patient in the exact same soil-depleted conditions that permitted colonization in the first place. And if this is resonating with you and you'd like my eyes on your case and you're in one of the states that I practice, the next step is to watch the free training that's in the description below. It prepares you to book a health mystery map call with me, and it gives you a clearer picture of whether what I do fits where you are in your healing journey. The next question that this video didn't really fully open up was what happens further downstream when stomach acid has been compromised for long enough. The connection between stomach function and what's going on in your small intestine and the rest of your gut microbiome is huge. And that's where this terrain story goes next. So check out this next video over here. I'm Dr. Kenny, Root Cause Health Detective. Thank you for watching, and I will see you in the next video.